Kia ora and welcome to the Dive In Festival for 2022. My name is Josh Roach and I'm the Chief Executive for Marsh in New Zealand. And this year we're returning in a hybrid model, which is pretty awesome. So we have colleagues and friends and partners joining us in the room here in Auckland, and special thanks to all of you who have joined us as well from around the world on Zoom. Marsh is not only a very proud global partner of the Dive In Festival, but we're also a very proud local partner for the conversation that we're hosting this morning with our partners at AIG and Wotton and Kearney. And given where we are in the world here in Auckland, New Zealand, I also believe that we're one of the very first events to be hosted for the Dive In Festival for 2022, which is pretty special for all of us here in Aotearoa. For those of you who might be less familiar with the Dive In Festival, Dive In was launched in 2015 and is a global movement within the insurance sector to support the development of inclusive workplace cultures. Its mission is to enable people to achieve their potential by raising awareness of the business case, as well as promoting positive action for diversity in all its forms. In previous years, we've explored how organisations can embrace a more diverse and inclusive workforce, but the challenge for us and the task for us this year is slightly different. And this year, we're being tasked with building braver, psychologically safe work cultures that allow us and allow our people and our colleagues to feel safe, valued, respected, and importantly, free to express themselves. Specifically today, though, for this event, we'll be discussing ageism in multi-generational workplaces. And if you consider your own workplace, you may be experiencing up to 5 different generations in play right now. And often to make sense of this very broad range of ages, we apply stereotypes, we apply branding to those who might be younger or older than us, and quite often we fall foul as well of being dismissive of the skills and the attributes of those around us who might be slightly different in age. At Marsh here in New Zealand, we also have representation from across 5 generations, all the way through from the forgotten generation through to Generation Z. And roughly 3/4 of our colleagues at the moment, though, sit in generations X and Y. And this in itself presents its own challenges, because this is quite a broad range of ages in itself, because it represents people born from 1965 all the way through to 1996. And if you just think about how much has changed over this period, our data is also suggesting that roughly 18% of our colleagues will likely retire over the next 8 years. And for me personally, that raises the question about our preparedness and our ability to plan ahead for what's likely to be quite a significant evolution in our workforce over the next decade. Also, if you consider the risk landscape that we're experiencing today, from the global mega themes such as climate change, such as cyber, such as the war in Ukraine and associated supply chain disruptions, and then take that down to what we're experiencing here in Aotearoa at the moment, such as the impacts of inflation and the ever-present risk of natural catastrophe. These risks to me, right now seem to be at unprecedented levels. And when I think about our ability at Marsh to help our clients to effectively solve for these risks, creating a culture where our colleagues across all generations, with all varying degrees of experience, if these colleagues, feeling safe, feeling respected, and importantly, free to express themselves. And this is going to be key to us promoting our best thinking for clients, whilst enabling us to be the risk advisor of the future. The speaker this morning, who's going to lead us through a conversation on generalising generations, addressing ageism in multi-generational workplaces, is Ola Ola is drawn to roles that reduce inequities and has a decade of experience providing solutions in the finance and health sector. With his experience in managing dynamic projects and transforming equity initiatives through innovation, he's energized to also use his lived experiences of exclusion to convert conversations about inclusion and fairness into meaningful action. Ola has a bachelor's degree in commerce from the University of Auckland and a master's degree in business from the University of Queensland. From this, he has worked with clients in health, hospitality, and not-for-profits to create messaging that improves organisational outcomes. Ola, over to you, and thanks for joining us today.
Kia ora. Round of applause for Josh. Kia ora. Ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kaka, ka tangi hoki ahau. Tihei mauri ora. He honore, he kororia ki te atua, he maungarongo ki te whenua, he whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Te hunga mate ki te hunga mate, ko tātou ngā waihotanga iho o rātou, mai kia tātou, tēnā tātou katoa. Tālofa lava mā roa lava le soifua mai le langi e mamā, ko a sau tōku maunga, ko Samina Toto tōku awa, ko Vaisala me Vaivasetai o Kuhapu, no Pasifika a hau, ko Maaola Samina Toto Milo Vali Ioane tōku ingoa. Now, for our international audience who may not have heard a mihi or a pepeha before, a pepeha is my way of introducing myself, showing my background, connecting myself to the environment and the land around me. And so what I said is my mountain is Asau in Samoa, my ocean or waters is Samina Toto. That's the name of the waters behind my grandmother's house in Samoa. My villages in Samoa are Vaisala and Vaivasetai. I am Pasifika, more specifically Samoan and Fijian, and my full name is Maaola Samina Toto Milo Vale Ioane. And so the longest name you'll hear today, I'm sure, Maaola means rock of life. Samina Toto means the ocean that bled, and Ioane means a gift from the heavens. But haters will say that it means John. So for any Johns out there, we are gifts from the heavens. Thank you. And so my pronouns are he, him, and like Josh mentioned, I'm the general manager at an organization called Diversity Works, looking after membership and community. We've been around for about 30 years. We are the national body for workplace inclusion, and our goal, our mission, is to support organizations to do workplace inclusion well and do well because of it. And so I'll share my screen, whānau. And while I'm getting this ready for us, I want to thank the whānau here. Thank you, Nicola, Dominique, Alana, Misha, Karen, Stevie, Charlene, AIG, Wotton and Kearney, Marsh, everyone. Thank you for moving with me this morning as we switch from in-person to Zoom. Honestly, the response to my circumstances this morning has been heartwarming, to say the least. It's super empathetic, and so I'm really, really grateful. And so let me share my screen. Orange screen that says tēnā koutou. Can I get some sort of response? Josh, whānau, chat box, all good?
All good.
Oh, kia ora. Now, because we're not in person, and I'd love to get the chat box firing up, I have a question to start us off with, whānau. That question is, on a scale of Moana, we love Moana, warrior, goddess, how are you feeling right now? And so we've got the scale here, team. We've got 1 to 6. 1 is like, oh, I'm curious. 2 is, what the heck am I doing here? 3 is, I'm ready to attack. Let's do this. 4 is, I'm not ready. My hair's not great, so my video is going to stay off, even though it's, even though I'd love to interact. Number 5 is, let's chill with this. And number 6 is, I'm not too sure. Can we get some ratings going? Thank you, Barbara, Laura, kia ora, Chantel, Doris, thank you, Christy. We've got a 3. We're ready to attack. I'm seeing a lot of vibing and a lot of dancing. If you're in New Zealand, that might be because we had a longer weekend. We've got Letitia. Thank you. We've got a 4. Letitia, I feel you. Thank you so much. Darcy on a 5. We've got this going. And if you're in person, feel free to turn to the person next to you and be like, I'm feeling a 4. Keep it going, team. And so we can all see how we're feeling, and we can balance our energies that way. So while we keep that going, thank you, Amy and Mary, everyone, thank you. While we keep that going, this morning, if I'm being honest, I was at a 4, which is why we switched to Zoom. I was like, oh my goodness, my hair's usually an afro too. So what you see right now is 2 tubs of gel. take that. That's a strong hold here, Jao, for you. We've got representation from California here. Kia ora, Jacqueline. And greetings from London. Hello, Jason. Now, whānau meaning family. I am at a 5. And so let's vibe into this. Yeah, are we good? Kia ora, Minnesota, Houston, Texas. Let's do this. And so I wanted to share a video to start us off with. And this was an international campaign.
So what's this all about?
Can I say it again? I'm too old for this.
You just want me to say what people say about me.
Weird question, I guess.
My teacher says you'll grow out of it. It's just a phase.
It was never a phase. I never grew out of it.
I guess I'm too reckless, I don't know.
People like to talk very loudly to me.
They say I don't think things through.
You're looking still good for your age.
I'll figure it out when I'm older.
You are having a senior moment.
When the focus is on my age,
Life seems to get a little bit harder.
It feels like I'm not given a chance.
I need to keep up.
Or get out of the way.
I lack experience.
Or too much experience.
I'm baggage.
Only weighing people down.
Looking at my age.
Like it is a disease.
Where I work, no one takes me seriously.
It makes me feel powerless.
And it hurts.
When people see only my age.
And so, team, it is so true, right? Age does not define us. And I love that video. I agree with you, Caitlin. Goosebumps galore. And Matthew, we can send out a copy for this as well. It's available on YouTube. Now, in many cases, it's true that age doesn't define us. And you'll find that, yes, today we will be talking about ageism in the workplace. We'll be talking about multi-generational workforces. And there are 5 generations in many of our workforces, like Josh mentioned earlier. Now, we know that in Aotearoa, New Zealand alone, our labour market's also undergoing significant change. More than 1 in 3 workers are now aged over 50, and that's an increase from 17% 3 decades earlier. So massive context there. And to go further, that number is projected to reach 35% by 2038. Now, from another perspective, team, the proportion of workers under the age of 34 will decrease to 33% by 2033 in New Zealand. Now, to provide further context there, that figure was 49% in 1988. What does it look like in your country? Now, interestingly, in 2021, the World Health Organization released insights saying that, wait for it, half of the world's population are ageist. And so we've got a couple of things happening here, team. We have multi-generational workforces, yet there seems to be globalized and many times inaccurate views of individuals based on their age. And so in saying that, I want to make one thing extremely clear here before we proceed, and that is when it comes to age, we all have stories to share. Many of us may have heard assumptions similar to the ones we heard in that video. And if you have, can I get you to type yes in the chat box or turn to the person next to you and give them a nod? And so for me, stories in my experience, for me on my LinkedIn, for example, I removed the years that I completed my university degrees because of the fear of someone counting backwards and attaching my age to the value that I could add to their network. I recall in a previous role asking management for more complex work around strategy development, implementation, and instead I was asked to look after Instagram because younger people are better at it. Now, when I was in banking, some customers would be shocked when they met me in person. I had one customer ask me, "What are you, 12?" And I responded, I'm old enough to look after your accounts. Let's do this. So with some attitude there. And so there are many stories, team stories that we don't usually reflect on, but I challenge you to do so. What is your story? And is that story enough to make us want to change? Now that's for you to answer, but ultimately, I do want to recognize your story. I also want to recognize the impacts on the people around us and on our own lives too. And so very briefly, this is what we'll be covering today. We'll start with understanding. We'll talk about the broader case for diversity and inclusion. We'll be more specific with defining ageism. Then we'll connect age to the intersectionalities that we know to exist across different dimensions. And we'll talk about its impacts. And then finally, the how behind the what and the why. And thank you, team, for providing examples in the chat box. It's awesome to see that going. Feel free to check that out. And so, team, I also want to say, let's be real, right? Throughout this presentation, I'll provide some examples of ageism. Let's be honest about it. I do want to challenge and provide a space for reflection. And in being real, I might say something like, I don't know, unfortunately, we don't have to look far for examples of ageism. Ouch. I might say ageism is everywhere, or I might say it's so deeply embedded in society in ways that we might not even be aware of. I'll say things like that throughout. And so I would love for you to feel challenged and feel like you can reflect. I read recently for our whānau in London, sorry to say this, I read recently that ageism is the most common form of discrimination in workplaces in UK. I also know that through our own research at Diversity Works, we found that various academic publications in the last couple of years highlighted perceptions about employees aged 45 years and over, highlighted them as less innovative and less resilient. And so they're facing a range of discrimination and stereotypes in employment. So there is a lot to be real about, a lot to challenge, and a lot to reflect on. So let's begin with a broad understanding of the importance of D&I. And I'll keep this slide quite brief. Okay, and so we know that there are many benefits to an intergenerational workplace. That's where we're engaging with people from different age groups. We're able to share knowledge and expertise. And through a massive lit review that our organization conducted, we know that there are 3 layers of benefits when we engage effectively with diversity and inclusion. The first is societal. You know, we achieve social equity. That's reducing inequality through access to employment, inequity reduction in service design. We can achieve co-production. That's collaboration between different groups. And then social cohesion. That's greater levels of collaboration and shared understanding outside of the 4 walls of our organization. Now, that's what we say is the right thing to do. Diversity and inclusion is the right thing to do. Now, if you're not convinced, we have a second layer. It's what we call productivity outcomes. And here the proposition is that there are tangible positive outcomes. If we do this thing called D&I, DEI, DEIB, whatever you want to call it, if we do it correctly and effectively, we know that we can achieve innovation because there's increased diversity, more likely to produce that divergent thinking. And through that thinking, people feel valued enough and motivated enough to contribute to team performance. You know, I think if we're talking about age in the workforce, there's this beautiful interaction that I've felt personally between older and younger workers when there's comfortable sharing, where both parties can play an important role in each other's career development. And so that second layer there tells us that it's not just the right thing to do, it might be the smartest thing to do because of that tangible outcome. Now, there's a third layer that we call prospectivity outcomes. Now, whether we like it or not, diversity and age is occurring. We mentioned that there are 5 generations in our workforce. We know what it's going to look like in the future in New Zealand with an aging workforce. And so we have 2 choices. We can either wait and see, or we can be kind of proactive and ride the forces of change beforehand. And so by doing DEI effectively, we know that we can project more accurately into the future because perspectives of the outside world are informed from within. Now, I'm thinking talent pipeline. I'm thinking retention. I'm thinking companies tapping into wide ranges of knowledge, ideas, and unique strengths from each generation. And so that's what we say can happen if we're implementing DEI correctly. And of course, that's all tied in with a culture of inclusion. You can't just have diversity. You need to incorporate cultures of inclusion to make sure that people feel welcome. And you might have heard the phrase diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. And equity, what many people say, is sharing the playlist that we dance to. So all good? All good. And thank you for keeping the chat going, team. Now, next, let's get more specific, team. Let's define ageism, okay? And so what is ageism? I think three things: stereotypes, how we think; prejudice, how we feel; and discrimination, how we act. Now, ageism refers to stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination directed towards others or ourselves based on age. And we'll unpack that in future slides. Now, at one extreme, team, we have overt ageism, where we categorize and divide people in ways that lead to injustice and exclusion. And that's what the World Health Organization defines ageism as here as well. Now, at a more subtle level, the way we think about age can actually affect the day-to-day decisions we're making when we're recruiting, when we're promoting, remunerating, training, designing jobs, restructuring, etc. The list goes on, right? And so to expand on this, there are three ways that ageism is expressed. And so we'll cover that in the next 3 slides. But I do want to say here that ageism is interesting because it involves bias against a moving target, right? Because we're all going to be at different ages at some point. We go through different life stages. And so everyone is exposed to ageism at multiple points in their lives. And so that's why we say that ageism involves bias against a moving target. And so in terms of the expressions of ageism, the first one I wanted to talk about here is institutional ageism. So we define this as the laws, the rules, the social norms, the policies and practices that exist in institutions that unfairly restrict opportunities and systematically disadvantage individuals because of their age. Now, examples of this might include mandatory retirement. And fun fact here, New Zealand actually doesn't have a retirement age. At age 65, there's an entitlement to apply for superannuation, but no retirement age. And so some people leave prematurely for health reasons, caring responsibilities, workplace flexibility woes, but there is no retirement age in Aotearoa. What does it look like in your country? And so other examples include excluding older people in medical research or in any research, health procedures or treatments restricted to certain age groups. So we see here examples of institutional ageism. And so that's very briefly what we define that as. Now, a question, team. Can anyone else think of other examples? And if you can, feel free to put that into the chat. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Bruno. The next expression of ageism we have here is interpersonal ageism. Has anyone heard of interpersonal ageism? Feel free to raise your hand in your teams or type in the chat box. So when we say interpersonal, thank you, Annette. When we say interpersonal, we mean it occurs within interactions between 2 or more individuals. Right, and so in this context of ageism, it can include disrespectful behavior, patronizing language, and being overly accommodating. And so we sometimes see this in power dynamics, and start to unpack this in your mind and see if this exists in your space. In some cases, you might be a younger manager looking after older individuals. Now here we've heard stories of conflict or misunderstanding because sometimes it still feels weird to be a young manager because historically age has been closely related to experience, which is closely related to respect and eventually leadership. And so the question I usually ask people when they find it difficult to work with a younger manager is, why do you feel that way? If age wasn't a factor here, would you still feel the same? And so other examples include when we use age to devalue an individual's work. So that's the example you see on screen saying that's pretty good for someone their age. We sometimes discredit someone's capacity as well, saying they're too young to understand or they're just old and they're just confused. Sometimes we're more patronizing, where we say they must be having a senior moment. Who's heard that one before? Feel free to type a yes in the comments. And other times as well, we might speak a bit louder or slower or simplify our language in an attempt to relate. And those are based on assumptions. And so we've got some examples in the chat. That beard makes you look older. Thank you, Anthony. I've heard that as well. I've heard my slick back hair makes me look older. Thank you, Stacey. Yes, many people have heard these statements before. And so that's interpersonal ageism. The third expression of ageism that I wanted to go over is what we call self-directed ageism. And so this one is probably one that I found myself slipping into quite a bit personally. It's this internalized bias and the belief that you shouldn't or you couldn't do something based on your own age. And so we usually express this through humor. We're discounting our own abilities or our strengths. And examples of this include, flip side of what we saw previously is instead of saying they're having a senior moment, we tend to do that to ourselves. Like, oh, sorry, I forgot, I'm having a senior moment today. Or I don't know where I placed my pens or my laptop, I'm having a senior moment. Other examples include, I'm too young to be a manager, or I'm too old to start a new career. And who's heard that one before? Another one is, I'm too young, they won't take me seriously. I know my stuff, I'm qualified, but because of my age, I feel like it won't be as valued. Or I've been in a workplace where people have been for 20 years. I come in as a new manager. I don't know if they'll take me seriously. Have we heard this before? Thank you, Stacey, for sharing. It's very common for us to actually have this ageism towards ourselves many times. And it does sometimes stop us from applying for different positions, Stacey, like you mentioned. So these are examples, and I challenge you to think of examples in your own space as well. And so at this point, I want to say that, of course, institutional, interpersonal, and self-directed ageism, they're not mutually exclusive. They can exist together. They can also intersect with and compound other forms of discrimination, like homophobia, racism, sexism, and the list goes on. So those are our three expressions. And I found this quote from Ashton Applewhite really interesting. Ashton says, the paradox of ageism is that the other that you're prejudiced about is your future self. So I'm not going to explain that. That says a lot within itself. But I want to pause here, team, and conduct a reflection activity with 250 online participants, as well as those in person as well. Let's do something here. I'm going to show statements on the screen. If you're attending in person, you can raise your hand and have a look around in the room and see who else has raised their hand. If you're online, you can press the raise hand icon, or you can type in the chat box saying yes. That's completely open too. And I'll show those statements. And I just want to get a sense of if you have heard these statements before. So if you've heard these statements before, please respond, and we'll start flooding that chat box. And so, older people are away sick all the time. Younger people don't have the resilience. They are entitled and they won't stick around. Older people are bad with technology. Now the chat box is just flooding with yeses. Love it. Absolutely, another person said. Some people are too old to learn. Some people are too young to learn. Just got yeses flooding through. Younger people are so unreliable. Hashtag rude. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Thank you, Sarah. We're hashtag rude team combined here. Younger people have no real world experience. Oh, that's a massive one. And finally, older workers are getting in the way of job opportunities for younger workers. So I see a lot of yeses. I see some ouches. I see some hashtag rude. And so, yeah, these are the statements that exist, and many of us have heard a lot of this. So I've got Erin with an eye roll. Thank you, Erin. And so I want to ask, team, are these myths or are they facts? Please respond. Myths. myths. Awesome. So let's reflect on that and let's just pause. We've got so many people flooding the chat box. I appreciate it. We've got some other reflections saying that sometimes it can be both. Sometimes we can take a view from one, and sometimes we can globalize that and apply it to many people. And thank you, Darcy. Each person is unique. Absolutely. And so I wanted to talk about a couple of myths here. For example, older workers getting in the way of job opportunities, or younger people not having the resilience, they won't stick around. Research has actually found that age has little relationship with a person's commitment to work. And while young people are sometimes characterized as lacking the work ethic compared to older workers, that's another example of an unfounded ageist stereotype. And so other research that we've seen is that the evidence of substantial differences in work attitudes between generations is thin. There is more difference within the so-called generational categories than between. Now, you might be thinking now, oh my gosh, when I put together a marketing plan, or when I think of my customers, I'm thinking of them in terms of millennials and Gen X and Gen Z. If there's more difference within that generational category than between the categories, what does that mean for our strategies? So all of this starts to unpack. And so like Darcy mentioned, we are individuals, we are unique. And so I wanted to pause there for further reflection as well. A question, and I said I would challenge. No, you don't need to answer. You can keep this in your mind. But do you think ageism exists in your workplace? Cool. We've got a few yeses, we've got a no, we've got definitelys and absolutelys. Now, a concept to help us unpack our reflections for this and ageism existing in our workplace, for those who said no, or for those who are a bit unsure, we talk about in and out groups here. And so in and out groups, naturally, I know for me at least, I do this a lot. I form categories in my mind of groups, and it just happens, right? Because our brains like people like us, and we tend to put people into boxes. That's how stereotypes occur. They help us to make sense of things. And sometimes they have an element of truth in them, like you said in the chat box, but then that view gets globalized and we're applying that view to everyone who's 25 or to everyone who's 30. We think that all older people are bad with technology, or no person under the age of 30 can be an effective manager because I know another 25-year-old and I wouldn't consider them to be the manager type. And so who forms our in and out groups? That depends completely on our context and our environment. Often in workplaces, team in and out groups can be formed on dimensions like roles, functions, what team you sit on, who you report to. But in this case, let's think about in and out groups based on age. Do in and out groups exist in your organization based on age? And again, I'm going to smack across some questions for reflection. You don't need to answer. How does it feel to be part of a group if you are part of a group based on age? What are the challenges caused by the existence of these groups? Who are you more or less inclined to interact with? Is it because you don't know how to interact with them, or you just don't like them? That's a different story. Now, the final question here is it possible to dismiss the skills and experiences of those around us based on their age? Now, I ask you to reflect on these questions because it helps to make the content real. So if you really want to challenge yourself, for those of you who said no, ageism doesn't exist, after reflecting on these questions, has your answer changed? And so that's ageism for us and how we tend to put people into different groups and how it could potentially relate to your context. And so let's move on to intersectionality and age. So when we say intersectionality, it's when multiple factors intersect, right? When they're crossing over, and it can result in sometimes very complex forms of exclusion. And what we say here is that people are not just older, they're not just younger, their identities consist of more than age, right? There are traits such as gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, apologies for the spelling error there, physical and cognitive ability, religion, class, the list goes on. And so intersectionality, let's break it down into specific into specific dimensions. Now, there's a quote here that I really think is quite encompassing of what we're talking about. It says that ageism can interact with other forms of bias, sexism, ableism. It can also exacerbate disadvantage and compound the impact of well-being and health. And so that sets the scene quite nicely for how these things engage with each other. And so, gender, let's talk about it. Gender and age. And so there's a ton of research out there, right? Evidence on the combined impact of sexism and ageism in older age. And it says that it's quite mixed. And so some research has concluded that older women relative to younger men and younger women, they bear the brunt of multiple forms of discrimination. And so there's research as well, I think it's in Australia, that found that women's perceptions of discrimination do not vary with age, but that younger men perceive it more often than older men. In some contexts in the workplace, younger men are still experiencing, unpleasant initiation rituals. Older women in some contexts are often in the situation of being impacted by patriarchal norms, the norms that hold men in primary power. We see and we read that women can also face greater external and self-directed pressures to hide the signs of aging than men do. There's quite a bit that appears in terms of the crossovers of gender and age. When we talk pay equity, it's showing major disparities in some sectors, not just in respect to gender, but as it intersects with age as well. We've got a few chat box reflections here as well. So I encourage you to read that. So that's gender and age. Let's talk about age and ethnicity. Now, I'll speak of this from quite a specific angle here. We know that the predominant view remains that we all age in roughly the same way, and that as we age, we'll transition into a period of retirement and reduce our responsibilities, but that's not always the case. If I think of Maori and Pasifika people here in Aotearoa or back in my home countries, we assume new roles and we assume new responsibilities as we age. I have aunties who are high chiefs, and then they take on this whole other full-time job after retirement. And so this can also be the case in other cultures, but it's important to realize what age means with ethnicity or with background here. And so what you might be reflecting on right now is while progress is being made in challenging racial discrimination in the workforce, we still see some significant disparities in employment rates, progression to senior roles, and so on. Now, briefly here, sexual orientation and age. There's a developing body of research that we know from what we've done with our partners here at Diversity Work, is when looking at how age, gender, and sexual orientation work together, we see that it can create exclusion, right? There's emerging challenges as members of rainbow communities specifically move into their later years. There are strongly held views expressed at different times in history, and that impacts our development as rainbow community. There are many older employees that have experienced and continue to experience quite harsh bullying, discrimination, and exclusion. And it again reminds us of that historical trauma that they may have faced, so they continue to carry those scars. And so it's also important here to note, especially with age and sexual orientation, that sometimes, at least for me personally, there's a negotiation of one's sexual identity in different spaces. So it's an ongoing process, and this presents new challenges at different life stages. Are you still with me, team? Can I get a yes in the chat box? And so we've talked about, thank you, we've talked about the intersectionalities here. We've talked about sexual orientation, we've talked about gender, we've talked about ethnicity, and no doubt there's a lot more out there. And so in this next section, I only want to briefly touch on this. There are lots of different impacts of ageism, but I just wanted to talk about a few here. So we got this from the World Health Organization's 2021 report. Ageism, the impacts of it, it can increase social isolation and loneliness. It can increase the risk of violence and abuse, and reduces people's commitment to the organization they work for. Now think of this in your own context. Have you ever felt this way because of age in your workplace? Ageism is very serious, has far-reaching consequences for our health, our well-being, and also our human rights. And so I'm not going to dive too deep into this for the sake of time. I encourage you, I implore you to go and do your research on different impacts of ageism that exist out there. But for the purposes of progressing this presentation, let's move on to the final section, right? The big how behind the what and the why. And that is where to from here. Now, with our partners, we've put together this list of 7 better practices, we like to say, that you can incorporate into your organization to deal with ageism. So 1, know your workforce. I was quite inspired to hear Josh talk about data, people data in the organization. And so know your workforce, know who's there. And of course, getting that information in a respectful and sensitive manner. 2nd is build awareness and bust myths. Perhaps run more of these types of presentations. That's not a plug for me. That's me encouraging you to find other learnings out there. The 3rd is integrate age into your DEI strategy and action plan. Many times when we're considering dimensions of diversity, we don't discuss age. Why is that when it affects all of us so strongly? And so integrating that into our strategies would be useful. Let's review our policies and our practices to make sure that we're as inclusive as possible. And a question that we can ask here is, okay, looking at our policies and practices, are we inclusive to most or are we exclusive to some? Create and support intergenerational teams. If you already have intergenerational teams, are we asking them the questions around how would you like to be supported in this space to enhance our engagement? Again, we see here health and well-being. Let's invest in that. Let's find innovative ways to invest in that, considering the intersections with ethnicity, with gender, with sexual orientation. How can we make it more culturally sensitive? How can we make our health and well-being practice more aligned with people's values outside of work? And finally, invest in training. Now, I wanted to bring this, make this quite individual, so that you can have some key takeaways, because keeping an eye out for ageism or working on DEI strategies is no one's full-time job. Or some of us might have that as full-time job, but if you're working in your day job, it's sometimes tough to figure out how you can make a difference without doing anything big and shiny and fancy. And so I wanted you to go away with these key takeaways. What can you do? First, I say recognize context and stay curious. Let's stay curious enough, team, to engage in that self-reflection, to be self-aware. And that's key because it allows us to evaluate our own biases, process what we've experienced, examine our thoughts, feelings, and actions, and also being kind to ourselves and saying we're human. It's okay for us to unpack like this. I've been ageist many times before, and I'll admit that unknowingly. And so it's time for us to process that reflection. Let's go through it. Let's remain vigilant. Let's recognize stereotypes. Let's avoid making assumptions. Assumptions like older workers are holding out for retirement. They don't want to learn new skills. Let's convert those exclamation marks into question marks. And instead of assuming that someone behaves a certain way, ask yourself why you think that way. Think of a situation in which you wanted to know a person's age. Why? What changed when you learned their age? Did anything change at all? Other things to look out for are like social cues, the kinds of jokes that we say about old or young age. And often we say it with affection, we say it in jest, but they can also be signs of bias. What happens to new employees entering the workspace and listening to this kōrero or this conversation? And again, it begs a question. If most people are in on the joke, are we inclusive to most, or are we being exclusive to some? And so that's recognizing context and staying curious. The next 2, keeping connected and welcoming conversation. Let's open the dialogue with employees, with each other. Let's create a safe space where we can question, where we can feel comfortable enough to share our concerns, engage in that respectful discourse. We know that that's vital to address ageism in the workplace. So there are different things that you can do here, right? In terms of challenging each other, let's create a way where we can engage with our outgroups and be like, okay, let's explore. Again, converting exclamation marks to question marks. Practically what this might look like, you might avoid making disparaging comments about others or even about yourself, saying things like, oh, I'm old-fashioned, or my old brain can't process that, or back in the day, you know, those subtle sort of comments that might appear harmless at the surface might do more in the background. And so it might be playful, but has the potential to make other older employees feel discriminated against here. Now, something I did mention before around generational labels. Do we need to avoid using generational labels such as Boomer, Gen X, Millennial, Gen Z, since these labels have stereotypes attached to them? Is it better to refer to specific age ranges? Now, a challenge here, team. We work with an amazing human called Jeff Pearman, who helped us put this content together. He says that while using labels like millennials and Gen Z, they aspire to address the needs of all generations. It's methodologically, oh my gosh, my lisp is getting in the way. It's flawed in many ways, and it's based on unfounded stereotypes and can inadvertently pit generations against each other. And that can fuel ageism. So some questions to think about here, I've asked a lot. And so recognize context, stay curious, keep connected, and welcome conversation. Now, to close us off, I'll say that inclusion requires a new type of leader. We need to understand our workforce, who's there, understand each other, understand ourselves in this space, and feel confident and courageous enough to engage in important conversation. Because if we don't engage in important conversation, we might never achieve a culture of inclusion.
It's easy to put people in boxes. There's us, and there's them. The high earners, and those just getting by. Those we trust, and those we try to avoid. There's the new Danes, and those who've always been here. The people from the countryside, and those who've never seen a cow. The religious, and the self-confident. There are those we share something with, and those we don't share anything with.
Velkommen. Jeg kommer til at stille jer nogle spørgsmål i dag. Nogle af dem kan godt være lidt personlige, men jeg håber, I vil svare ærligt på dem. Hvem herinde i rummet var klassens klovn? Hvem er bonusforældre?
And then suddenly, there's us. We who believe in life after death. We who've seen UFOs. And all of us who love to dance. We who've been bullied. And we who've bullied others. And then there's us, the lucky ones who've had sex this past week. We who are broken-hearted. We who are madly in love. We who feel lonely. We who are bisexual. And we who acknowledge the courage of others. We who have found the meaning of life. And we who have saved lives. And then there's all of us who just love Denmark. So maybe there's more that brings us together than we think. TV2 Denmark. all that we share.
Thanks, team. And so that's completely true. There's more that brings us together than separates us. And so it reminds me of something that my dad told me before I moved to Australia for further study. He said, look, right now you're going to feel different. You're going to enter a world where you feel like you're the only person of your kind there. What you need to do is you need to learn the game, play the game, win the game, and then change the game. And I've heard different versions of that saying, but it did change how I viewed everything. And so I encourage you, team, to engage with your space, learn the space, and feel victorious enough to change it. Because only when we have that bravery will we see ageism reduced or hopefully eliminated one day. We'll see. But thank you so much, whānau. Thank you, family. Thank you for having me today. I appreciate you all, and thanks for the engagement in the chat box. That was a flood. You can find these videos on YouTube. That one's called All That We Share, and the first one was from World Health Organization. Thank you so much, team. And so we've got a couple of questions. I think we do have time for questions. Any questions, team? And you can place them in the Q&A chat right there. Karen, it always gets me in the feels as well. I'm happy to announce we do have a New Zealand version in the works, and so hold out for that. I have a question here. It says that please tell me if this is true. Millennials and Gen Z tend not to stay longer at their jobs. I was rather shocked when a new graduate told me that a professor taught them a guideline about staying no longer than a year if they felt that the job was not leading them anywhere. If that's the case, how can my perception change of the effort to train new employees from those generations only to find out they are guided by what they are actually being taught? That's a really important question. Loaded question as well, because there's so many moving factors in this space. But what I will say, and I go back to the foundations here, is we're dealing with the individual in front of us, not the generation that exists in the world. And I would actually ask, when new employees are coming through, ask them what their aspirations are in this space, and potentially personalizing a plan based on what we know of that individual, and seeing what other moving parts in our recruitment strategy or our career advancement strategy need some rework to retain this talent. And so that's my response there. I hope it answers your question, my friend. Any other questions? And I've got a 9-second rule. If there are no questions in 9 seconds, I start singing Mariah Carey. So take that. Any other questions, team? Doris, I'd say the same thing as treating people as individuals when we're talking about changing people's perspectives. I would also say, is it, well, this is going to sound harsh, but I'm going to say it, is it our job to change their perspectives? What we say, and I say that from the position that I'm in, where our job is to listen, not listen to respond, and understand where people are at, and then make the changes in our practice, whether it be in the systemic stuff, whether it be in recruitment, to accommodate for those, not to accommodate, to address those perspectives as they appear in front of us. But I usually say, you know what, firstly, let's just listen, see where they're coming from, ask the whys, ask if they do have quite strong views on age, asking them, why do you feel that way? How do you address it? So yeah, open conversation always helps. I live by that statement, Darcy. I'm not sure if you mean listen or you sing Mariah Carey after 9 seconds. Cool. Have we got another question? How can employers build a workforce culture that addresses all generational needs? Thank you so much for that question. This is multifaceted, right? If I think of it in Aotearoa, we have a holistic approach where we consider a few things. We consider leadership buy-in, we consider diversity infrastructure, your policies, targeted or cornerstone. We consider career development, career development and advancement, recruitment. Then we also consider things like biculturalism, social impact, and inclusive collaboration. And so there are frameworks and matrices out there that are more holistic in its approach, that can address multiple diversity dimensions as well as intersectionalities. And I encourage you to explore what that looks like on our website. This is a plug, diversityworksnz.org.nz. It might be different country to country. I know Australia has one, the UK has one as well. And so that's a place that you can start if you're looking for something holistic and research evidence-based. In terms of what we can do as individuals, you know what, I hand on heart, I say that leaders hold so much influence in this space. And so it might seem like a cop-out, but it's all about conversation, in my opinion, right? And it's all about asking people, what do you need in this moment? What life stage are you at? What season are you going through? And so it's more so prevalent or obvious in this example I'm going to give you, or this scenario, right? You open up a survey and it asks you, how old are you? Now, your initial response would be a number, right? But if we were to take numbers away and they ask you to, you could only put text and you could explain your age, what would you say then? And I use that example to share that addressing generational needs sometimes requires us to go beyond age, right? And we might answer like, oh, I've been at the organization for 10 years, or I'm at a stage in my life where I have grandkids, or I'm ready to have kids. And again, that could apply to many different generations there. And so asking the questions is super important, I would say. Thank you, Barbara. We have Barbara. I am going to make a personal commitment to join the inclusion dance party. Bring it on. Now you're coming to a space where there'll be Nicki Minaj, Mariah Carey, and some Beyonce, okay? So bring it on. Thank you so much, team. I am sending a close with 3 minutes to go. Thank you for your feedback. Thank you for engaging so much in the chat box. And if you're in person, sorry I couldn't be there, maybe next time. But I will hand it back to the whānau, to Josh, to close us off. I appreciate you all. Kia ora.
Thanks, Ola. I think everybody was very excited to hear you sing Mariah Carey. That's why the questions are being held off. But look, thanks so much, and a lot of gratitude from me personally for a very inspiring and insightful presentation. I thought the examples of ageism were excellent. Your comments around self-directed ageism certainly have given me some food for thought personally. I think the better practices that you took us through was excellent. 3 that stood out for me were know your workforce. And it was only until I was sort of preparing for this session that I only truly understand that we had colleagues across 5 generations. And so that was something that I've only learned very recently. Integrate age into your D&I action plans and strategy, I think is excellent, as well as investing in employee health and benefits and well-being for all ages. I think they were, my sort of top 3. What can you do? I don't know if anyone sort of summarized these for you as the 4 C's. So the context, the curious, the connected, and the conversation. I thought was excellent and probably a pretty simple way of remembering those important points. And then I thought your final statement, Ola, was excellent and quite profound, and that is inclusion requires a new type of leader. And I think we can all take some insight and reflect on that comment as well. But look, really, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. I think that the key action for all of us and the call to action is really just to try and take your advice and try it and apply it as best we can to make sure that we're building braver and more supportive workplaces, and really, I guess, safer places, enabling our colleagues to feel safe, valued, and importantly, express themselves authentically. Well, thanks everybody, and also thanks to everyone who's participated. I thought the engagement was awesome. I think, Ola, you said it was a flood. I couldn't keep up. There were comments flying in, and that was awesome. And I think testament to your conversation as well. So have a great day everyone. Please participate in further dive in festival events, and also thanks to our partners at AIG and Wotton and Kearney. Thanks everyone. Have a great day. See you soon.
Bye. Thank you.